Okay, we've moved on from Menachot to Hullin. This week, I'd like to answer the question: if God commands you to eat treif, are you allowed to? Are you supposed to, or are you not understanding the command correctly? And we'll answer that question through a discussion of Eliyahu Navi and something that he went through, and the Midrashim offering different takes of trying to understand what exactly went on. But it'll actually be used in a halachic context. It'll begin answering a question that's purely from the realm of halakha, and it will branch out into the realm of Agadah, and then we'll try to understand at the end what the possible message behind the whole discussion and the argument between various Midrashim is about. So we'll start just to refresh our memory by a story that's told about Eliyahu Navi in Melachim Aleph, Perek Yud Zayin. This is when we're first introduced to him. So Eliyahu first appears in the reign of Achav, who was the wickedest, or one of the wickedest kings that we're told about. So, Vayomer Eliyahu Tishbi mitoshavei Gilad el Achav, Chai Adonai Elohei Yisrael asher amarti lefanav im yeh hashanim ha'ele talu matar ki im lefi dvari. Okay, fitting given the storm that we're experiencing now after a long drought, or a long period without rain. Eliyahu decrees a drought in that time. Vayidvar Adonai elav le'emor. And God says to Eliyahu, Lech mize ufanita lech kedma v'nistarta benachal Krit asher al pnei Yarden. So God says to Eliyahu, leave here, go east, and hide in this place Nachal Krit, the river of Crete, which is near the Jordan River. V'aya mi'anachal tishteh v'et orvim tziviti lechalkelcha sham. Drink from the river, and I've commanded orvim, which is traditionally translated as ravens, to feed you there. Vayelech vayas kedvar Adonai. Eliyahu listened. Vayelech vayeshev benachal Krit asher al pnei Yarden. He went there. Va'orvim mivim lo lechem uvasar baboker v'lechem uvasar ba'arev. So orvim, ravens, are bringing him bread and meat in the morning and at night. U'minanachal yishteh, and he drank from the river. Vayimiket yamim vayivash hanachal. And then, because there was no rain, at a certain point the river dried up. Ki lo haya geshem ba'aretz, because there was no rain. And then Eliyahu was commanded to go, and the story continues from there. So one. Yeah.
I was going to ask about the bread and the meat, but I guess that's where you're going with this.
Right.
Prefaced it.
Yeah. So we're going there. Right. So one thing that's obviously worth noting here that's interesting is that the water is a natural solution, whereas the bread and meat is ostensibly a supernatural solution. Right. He's drinking from a river, but then the food and the meat is brought to him every day by these orvim. So the question is, where is the food and meat coming from that is being brought to Eliyahu? So the answer suggested by the Gemara is actually quite surprising. So we'll see Chulin Daf Hey in the Ein Yaakov, which is our jumping point. It's actually on the tails of a discussion, a halachic question around shechita. Right, we know that shechita can be done by a zar. Any person can do a shechita, basically. And the question is, if somebody worshipped avodah zarah and then they slaughtered an animal, and they did it totally according to the halakha and in a completely kosher way, they had just worshipped avodah zarah in the past. Does that disqualify their shechita, or is it still something that can be eaten? So the Gemara is trying to understand the answer to that question, and it entertains the possibility that yes, in fact, that meat is completely kosher to eat, even though the man who slaughtered it was not a worshiper. So Guf Amar of Anan Amar Shmuel Yisrael Mumar Lavodat Kochavim Mutar Le'achol Mishchitato. So a Jew who is an apostate to idol worship, you are allowed to eat from his slaughtered animal. How do we know this? Because Yehoshaphat, who was the king of Yehuda, and he was a righteous king, a tzaddik, so we are told, ate at a feast that Achav, who was obviously not a worshipper, hosted. Okay, and the Gemara goes through a whole discussion about, we're skipping a lot of the detail about how do we know the Yoshefat from the meat that Achav slaughtered and not from other people, etc. That's not the point right now. But Lema Misayle, so the Gemara says, let's suggest a support for this idea of Shmuel's from the following story. These ravens brought bread and meat to Eliyahu in the morning and in the evening.
The meat was dead, though.
So the meat was dead?
Yeah.
What does basar mean? He was picking up like cattle and bringing
Yeah,
it
maybe. I'm just suggesting that the meat wasn't dead, though.
They just brought him a cow. They were like, here.
They brought him a cow. What, and then Eliyahu slaughtered the cow
maybe.
himself?
If you put a story this much detail, it would say if he slaughtered it and ate it.
I mean, I will say
And
there's
the bread is
nothing that
patakum.
explicitly rules that out, but I don't think that's the assumption, yeah. But perhaps, I don't know. That would get out of the problem that we're about to ask. V'amar Rav Yehuda amar Rav mibeit tapchei de'achav. And there's a teaching in the name of Rav that the ravens brought the meat from Achav's slaughterhouse. In other words, the meat was not kosher, ostensibly, right? Or, excuse me, sorry. From the fact that they brought the meat from Achav's slaughterhouse and the fact that Eliyahu ate it teaches me that you are allowed to eat the meat of an Yisrael Avodah Kochavim, because Achav himself was Yisrael who was a Mumar. So can I use that as a proof? So the answer is Al Pi Hadiבור Shani. That no, this was different because it was Al Pi Hadiבור. There was a divine command where God explicitly told Eliyahu, I'm going to command these Orvim to come bring you the meat and you eat the meat. What Al Pi Hadiבור Shani actually means, we'll see in a second. There's different ways to interpret it, but the simplest understanding, according to Rashi, is that when God tells you to eat the meat, whether the meat itself was kasher or not is almost irrelevant because you've been given a divine dispensation. Like one time, get out of jail free to eat it. So I can't learn from here that generally meat from that was slaughtered by a Yisrael Avodat Kochavim is permitted. Then the Gemara continues and says, "My orvim, what were these orvim that brought the bread and the meat?" Amar Ravina orvim mamash. So Ravina says it means ravens. What's the big deal? Amar li Rav Ada bar Manyume v'dilma trei gavre dehave shmayu orvim. Maybe it was two guys, and their names were both Orev orvim. So when God says "Vet orvim tziviti lecha kelcha Hasham," it means, and I commanded the orvim. I commanded orvim 1 and orvim 2 to come bring you the bread. It doesn't mean birds. Milo ktiv. Why does it not say "Vayargu et orev betzur"? Orev ve'et ze'ev v'gomer. Some proof about the idea that there was a person named Orev. So we know it's a name. Amar le, so he said back to him, Itr mai milta de tervaya v'shmai orvim. So he'd say it's very unlikely there's two people with the same name, if that's what you're suggesting.
One and thing two.
Thing one and thing two, right, Dr. Seuss. V'dilma al shem mikoman. So he says back, well, maybe their names weren't Orev or Orvim, but that's where they were from. And then you're referenced by the place that you're from. Right? Milo ktiv, doesn't it say, V'aram yatzu gdudim, v'yishbu me'eret Yisrael ne'ara ktana. V'kashel ankar le ne'ara, v'kar le ktana, v'amar av pedat ktana demin uran. Okay, so there's proof that tells you that a person can be referred to by the place they come from versus their actual name. Im ken orviyim mibayle. If so, it should have said orviyim instead of orvim. The fact that it says orvim means that it was actually birds, at least according to Ravina, and that's the conclusion that the Gemara reaches, at least here. So, taking a step back for a second, right? We saw that the question was raised around how Eliyahu could eat this meat if it was from Achav's slaughterhouse, in the context of trying to prove that a meat coming from a Jewish Oved Kochavim is permitted.
Is there a reason that we haven't asked about the bread? Bread is fine.
Pat akum, you mean? I don't know. I guess it's only an issue if it's pat akum and Achav was Yisrael, and you don't have I don't know the halachot of pat akum by an idol worshipping Jew.
No, it's interesting it doesn't bring it up at all. So that's a question only on the meat.
I mean, there's no issur of eating bread from a Jew, I guess. Unless you're saying if it was mixed with other things. I don't know. It's a good question. But if we understand Al Pi Hadiבור Shani as meaning God tells you to eat it, you eat it, and it doesn't matter, so the same thing would apply to the bread, right? There would be no reason to differentiate. Mm-hmm. But I think your question's a good one in light of a different suggestion that Ritva is about to make. Ritva says, Perush Rashi Zal, She'tiru lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu lefi shah, dichtiv et ha'orvim tziviti sham lechal kelcha. Right? Rashi says, Al Pi Hadiבור Shani was different because God told him to eat it, so I can't learn anything from here. And Ritva says, I don't know where Rashi got this from. How he understood this from the pasuk. Ve'od lemay de lo havi masik adaite de Al Pi Hadiבור harei shari le mitabchei de'acha va'ika mishum basar shenitalem min ha'ayin de'oser rav lekaman b'mechiltin. So he comes and asks a halachic question around the basar ne'elam min ha'ayin. If you can't see it and it's mixed in with a rov, less the point for us. What's more interesting here is ve'od lama yatir lo hakadosh baruch hu isur shelo letzorech וכי אין לו לקדוש ברוך הוא בשר של התר לתת לו, מן עובדיה או משבעת אלפים? Why does God have to go find asur meat to bring to Eliyahu and then tell him it's okay, you can eat it? He can bring him kosher meat. Why does he have to go out of it? God isn't able to bring him meat that's kasher to begin with. We know there were other people who lived there at the time that were tzaddikim. There was Ovadia, there were these 7,000 people. It wasn't that there was nobody who had kosher meat in that time. So then the Rizva gives, I think, a pretty ingenious reading of the sugya. He says as follows, L'chach nir'eh lefaresh, dem ikara nami havisal kadaitich, ki al pi HaKadosh Baruch Hu achalo, shivticho sheyaviu lo arvim min makom karov, min tavchei de'achav. That originally I could have thought that what Eliyahu thought was when God says, I'm going to provide to you and the Orvim are going to bring it to you, it means from a place that's close, like Achav's slaughterhouse, and not from somewhere far away. V'shma mina detabche de'achav kulu hitiro v'chederav anan. And that therefore it is a support for the teaching of Rav Anan because it was brought from a place that was close by. Because if it wasn't from close by, then Eliyahu would have been afraid that, or had to have been concerned about the idea of it coming from Rov, right? What is it, Deruba Parish? That any meat that you don't know where it comes from the Rov, and you have to be nervous about the Rov, right? Because Deha Ovadia v'chaverav mi'ut have. V'chol de Parish miruba Parish. That's what the phrase was, right? In other words, you're not understanding it correctly. It's saying, what was the original proof from here? It came from Achav's slaughterhouse, and therefore Eliyahu would have thought, and that's why it's a proof for Rav Anan to say that you're allowed to eat from a non-Jew idol worshiper, because if it wasn't from Achav's house, but was just stam basar from anywhere, so then Eliyahu would have had to have been concerned that it would have been asur simply because called the parish miruba parish, and that in that time the rov was not kosher. And then the answer is ufarkinan al pi hadiבור shani, and the answer then of no, it was through divine command. The answer is not what Rashi said, that therefore it's everything goes. It means v'hu iftichu lo sheyaviu lo afilu min hamiyut ki nakelu etzel Hashem yitbarach v'leika lememar degabe didei called the parish miruba parish. In other words, the answer of al pi hadiבור shani doesn't mean that I can't learn from this case more generally because God permitted asur meat. It means that, no, the application of any time you have meat, you don't know where it comes from, you assume it comes from the majority and therefore it's asur, still applies, but because God said to Eliyahu, I'm commanding you to bring this meat, it means that meat came from a place that was kosher. And therefore that rule is not a concern. Okay, just kind of an interesting halachic interpretation of this sugya. I want to now learn a Gemara in Sanhedrin, which kind of tells more of the context around Eliyahu, and then we'll get into the meat of different midrashim on this point. So the Gemara in Sanhedrin says as follows in Perek Chelek: Achav shushbinei hava. So Achav shushbinei hava. So the context here is about somebody in Chiel who rebuilt Yericho. Right? Yoshua had destroyed Yericho and then placed a curse and said, whoever rebuilds Yericho, right, his oldest son, he will start the gates, and with his youngest son's death, he will end the gates. And Chiel does that, and then that's in fact what happens, that his children die. So it says Achav was at his wedding, or he was his fellow. I'm not sure. Achav was Chiel's friend. Ata iyu ve'Eliyahu lemish al bishlama be'tamya. So Achav and Eliyahu came to be Menachem Avelim when Chiel's children died. Yativ v'ka'amar. So Achav sat and said, Dilma kimilet Yoshua hachilat lo yiricho al shem yiracheret v'lo yiracheret al shem yiricho. So Achav says, perhaps when Yoshua pronounced his curse, did he also mean that you couldn't rebuild Yericho and give it a different name, or build a different city and name it Yericho? And Amar Eliyahu and Eliyahu says, yes, the curse extended to that extent, that it was not just rebuilding Yericho and calling Yericho, but rebuilding it and giving another name, or rebuilding something else calling Yericho. Those were included in the curse. Amar Eliyahu, so Achav said to him, Hashta, Lafta de Moshe lo kamakaima dichtiv v'sartem v'adatem v'gomer uchtiv v'charaf Hashem b'chem v'tzat shemaim v'gomer v'hu gavra okim le'avodat kochavim al kol telem v'telem v'lo shavig le mitra demezal Miskid le leftia de Yoshua talmidei mekaima. So basically, Achav now is mocking this, and he says, Moshe, was Yeshua's teacher, said that anybody who worships Avodah Zarah will cause the rains to stop falling. And I've been worshiping Avodah Zarah for a long time now, and the rain is great. So you're telling me now that the student of Moshe, Yeshua, his curse is going to come true? So Miyad, so Eliyahu says, "Vayomer Eliyahu tishbi mitashvei Gilchai Hashem Elohei Yisrael Yom Matar Matar Kim Duchad V'Reid da da da." Now, so this Gemara is coming to explain why Eliyahu decreed a drought. Because the Psukim don't really tell us. They say, okay, Achav became king and he was wicked. Eliyahu comes and says, there's not going to be rain. Why did Eliyahu do that? So it's because of this conversation that he had. Okay, and then it continues and says, "Vahidvar Hashem elav le'emor lech mizeh ufanita lech kedma nisrata b'nachal krid va'orvim mivim lo lechem b'basar mehecha." So where did the basar come from? Amar V'yud Amarav mibei tabchei da'achav. So the Gemara Sanhedrin agrees with our Gemara in Hullin that the meat came from Achav's house. This is just kind of to finish off the Gemara. I thought it was almost a humorous Gemara. Darashahu glila kamed Rav Chizda. Mashal Eliyahu lema davar domeh legavra ditarke legalia ve'avde lemaftachei. So there was a drasha that a mashal for Eliyahu is somebody who locks the door and then loses the key. Because the context there was that Eliyahu decreed that the rain would stop, but then he wasn't able to bring it back. And that's why he had to go to the Shah Tzarfatit and revive her son in this whole story, because he wasn't able to unlock the gate that he had locked, which was the decree against the rain. Darash Rabbi Yossi b'Tzipori, Abba Eliyahu kapdan hava. So Rabbi Yossi from Tzipori said, Eliyahu was a kapdan. He was someone who gets very, he was makpid, he got worked up about little things. Hava ragil emete gabe. So Eliyahu used to come visit Rabbi Yossi b'Tzipori. Tlata yome velo ate. But after Rabbi Yossi said this, Eliyahu Hanavi didn't visit him for 3 days. Ki ata, and then after 3 days he came to him. Amar le amai lo ata mar. So Yossi asked him, why didn't you come for the last 3 days? So Amar le kapdan karateli. So he said, you called me a kapdan. So Amar le, Rabbi Yossi said back to him, he said, you proved my point, right? Like the fact that I said you were kaptan and you got so angry you wouldn't show up for 3 days just proves that you are kaptan. Mm-hmm. So thank you for proving my point. Yeah, that's kind of a funny story there. Okay. Good. So let's see now that in the Midrash there's another source given for where the meat came from, right? We just have this teaching from Rav that the meat came from Achav's house, but maybe it came from somewhere else. Why do I have to assume that? Vayikor Rabba Perek Yutet Piska Aleph. Amar Rabbi Shmuel Bar Amed Divrei Torah Tzrichin Hashchara v'Harava. You have to learn Torah in the morning and in the evening. Shneimar Miachin la'orev tzido lemod me'Eliyahu al yedei shishchir v'heriv b'Torah v'lo kvar zimanti lo orvim. So Eliyahu used to learn Torah in the morning and the evening, and God brought orvim to him. Shenemar ve'orvim mivim lo lechem u'basar. Mehechan hayu mevi'in lo. Where did they bring the bread and the meat from? Mishulchano shel Yehoshaphat. So not from Achav's house or table, but from Yehoshaphat's table. Because Yehoshaphat was the king of Yehuda in that time, and he was a tzaddik, we're told. So his meat ostensibly was fine. Right? Tanchumi Yondenu has a similar teaching. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, limdu min ha'orvim, learn from the ravens. Shiu mechal kelim et Eliyahu. They used to sustain Eliyahu. Shnei orvim mivim lo lechem u'basar b'boker v'gomer. U'me'echan hayu mivim. Where did they bring it from? Mishulchano shel Yehoshaphat, from Yehoshaphat's table. Why? Lefi shelo hayu rotzin otan ha'orvim likanes leveito shel Achav leotzi mishulchano klum leotot tzadik. The ravens did not want to go into Achav's house to get the meat and bring it to Eliyahu. Right? Because the ravens knew that Achav's house was full of avodah zarah. This is a proof that birds it'd be wise like birds, whatever. No, it's the opposite of the Gemara in this midrash, right? It says not only did the meat not come from Achav's house, but it specifically came from Yehoshaphat's house because the ravens didn't want to feed Eliyahu for meat that was coming from a house of avodah zarah. So it's like the Gemara in Hullin tried to use this as a proof to say that you can eat meat that comes from the idol worshiper's house is kasher. And this midrash is saying, no, the meat had to have come from somewhere else because there's no way Eliyahu could have eaten the meat that came from the house of an ovid avodah zarah. So it's kind of almost a different idea.
None of this seems to be proof, though. All this seems to be conjecture. Kind of pulling out of thin air, being like, if this, then the logic of this, meaning there's There doesn't seem to be a initial starting point that we can say for sure.
About where the meat came from?
Yeah.
Right, they're just saying it came from here, it came from there. Right.
It seems frustrating because the logic that they're coming up with makes sense, but the initial basis of their assumptions seems to be still debatable.
You're saying, how did Rav know it came from Achav's house?
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. Whereas they come along and say, no, it couldn't come from there. Kid him. Like,
Because here it does give a reason. It says, according to this logic, right, it had to have come from a place of a tzaddik, because it couldn't have come from a place of a zara. Because Eliyahu never would have been sustained from a place like that. So there is some rationale, but
right.
You're right that we didn't see a rationale for it coming from Achav's house specifically. But I think you are actually Baruch Shekivanta, because that'll at the end maybe we'll give an explanation for that or attempt to. Okay, the Abarbanel summarizes this debate nicely. Okay, so nobody knew where Eliyahu was, right? He was hiding. He decreed no rain. Obviously, he can't stay there. They're going to, right? There's going to be a warrant on him. So he runs away to Nachal Krit. And the Orvim were feeding him. והם עופות טמאים שחורים, ששם השם יתברך בליבם, שיביאו לאותו מקום לחם ובשר שתי פעמים בכל יום. So he says, these Orvim, the Abarbanel says, are black tamei birds, ravens, that God put in their hearts to bring bread and meat to that place. Okay? And you shouldn't ask, how did Eliyahu know that the meat was kosher? So first, our Abarbanel says what Rashi had said in the Gemara, that in fact Eliyahu knew that God commanded him to eat it, so he knew that he wasn't sinning by eating it, right? But here the Abarbanel says, yes.
Slightly different than earlier, because here he's saying, how do you know it's kosher? Because God sent it to him. Whereas earlier it says, who said he was allowed to eat it? Because God told him. Whereas meaning is differentiation between, regardless if it's kosher or not, Hashem told him to eat it, therefore it's fine. Whereas here he's saying, how do you know it's kosher? Because he's assuming it is, because Hashem told him to eat it, therefore it must be kosher. It's two slightly different things.
Okay, actually, so I think if we read the next line, so the Abarbanel actually clarifies and says, like the first opinion, that it means specifically that as a one-time dispensation, Eliyahu was allowed to violate a mitzvah of the Torah through the prophecy that he received. So here, Abarbanel actually is explicit in saying that no, it was actually prohibited meat, but he was allowed to eat it. This should actually remind us, Eliyahu does something similar in another context as well, very famously, where he violates a prohibition, l'tzorach sha'ah.
Oh, the korban outside the...
Yeah, he offers on the Bama when the Beit HaMikdash was standing, right on Har Carmel. Oh. So the discussion is, how is Eliyahu allowed to offer korban? The Bama were prohibited. It was l'tzorach sha'ah. So here we see Eliyahu is racking up a history of violating mitzvah in the Torah. This is a second example, potentially. Okay, וחז"ל אמרו בפרק הכל שוחטין, שמשולחנו של אחאב היו מביאים לו. So Chazal say that it came from Achav's house. ובתנחומה, but in the Midrash Tanchuma, אמרו שמשולחנו של יהושפט היו מביאים לו. We saw the tradition of the Midrash that it came from Yehoshaphat's table. ויש מהם ז"ל שאמרו שהיו עורבים אנשים סוחרים נקראים בשם עורבים. And then he says, in terms of who the Orvim were, we alluded to this before, there are some who say they weren't birds, but they were merchants. Okay, שהם היו יודעים עניין אליהו, they knew where Eliyahu was, ומעמדו, and his situation, ונתנו לו מזון בכל יום, והוא על דרך עורבי מרובה, okay, etc. So there's a machloket about who the Orvim were, which is less our point, but there's also a machloket about where the meat came from. And like Shimon said, really, what's going on here is there's a halachic and then an agadic component, which we'll talk about in a second. But the halachic argument about if it came from Achav's house or if it came from Yehoshaphat's house, the reason that that's important is because one you assume is kosher for sure, Yehoshaphat's house, and one you assume is prohibited because it comes from the house of an idol worshiper. And so that then informs your understanding of Al Pi Hadiבור Shani, right? Of like how was Eliyahu violating a mitzvah to Torah? Because if it comes from Yehoshaphat's house, he's not violating anything because it's kasher. So you only have to get backed into the corner of saying Eliyahu was allowed to violate a mitzvah of Torah because God commanded him to. If you say it comes from Achav's house, if you say it's from Yehoshaphat, you avoid that whole problem. So perhaps that's why the Midrashim are more inclined to say it came from Yehoshaphat's house, because they're just interested in saying, of course, Eliyahu isn't. Why go to a place of saying Eliyahu had to violate a mitzvah of Torah as a one-time thing, when you can just suggest that the meat was kasher to begin with? Whereas the Gemara is more interested in proving Shmuel's point that the meat that comes from Yisrael of Vada Kochavim is permitted. And in order to find that proof, then you can say it comes from Achaz's house because you have a halachic agenda in mind, even though it ends up getting rejected. But that's perhaps why there's the stream of thought in the Gemara that says it comes from the Achav's house versus in the Midrash where it's coming from Yehoshaphat's house. Because one of them is trying to prove something halachic and one of them is trying to, as much as possible, make Eliyahu be otot tzaddik, shelo ta'am shel chet. To kind of conclude this thought and then to answer Reuven's question of what's the source perhaps for Achav coming from Achav's house. So this whole discussion, where else do we see a discussion of ovim or ravens in the context of like water and
Mabul?
Yeah, right, mabul, right? Here we have the ravens by the nachal that Eliyahu is drinking from, and they're bringing food. So the ravens also brought, or were supposed to bring food or some sign to somebody during the context of water being kind of decreed on the land. Bereshit Rabbah makes that connection explicitly. Vayishalach et ha'orev, Noach sent the raven. Hadu dichtiv, shalach choshech vayachshich, vayetzei atzov ashov, Rabbi Yehuda b'shem Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Simon, hitchil mishivot shuvot. So the raven began to argue with Noach. Amar lo mikol be'emah chayav ha'of yesh kan, ve'en atam shlech ela li. So the raven says, you have all of these animals, why are you sending me, the raven? Amar lo, ma tzorach la'olam bach. So Noach says to the raven, who cares about you? Why? What good are you? The world doesn't need you. It's pretty
Very harsh statement.
very harsh, right out the gate, right? Right? Lo la'achila v'lo l'korban. Because we can't eat you, because you're not kosher, and we can't offer you as a korban, because you're tameh for korban. So what good are you?
You could say it's not Shabbos, the opposite. He's saying you haven't got like a tafkid, so I'm giving you a tafkid. Yeah.
That's what Noach is saying.
Okay, fine. I heard it much more sharp. He's like, you're useless. Nobody cares about you. So.
Oh, so if you die, it doesn't matter, right? Maybe that's what he meant, right?
Okay, fine. Let's go with a nice old.
You can go with he's giving him a mission versus he's sending him to his death, and it's kind of it doesn't matter. Either way, honestly, you could read it either way. So God says to Noach, you know what, I think actually you're right, because of the continuation. God says to Noach, no, he does have a purpose. And his purpose is that in the future...
No, that doesn't answer which one it was. They're both the same thing. The question is just, was he insulting him and saying nobody cares about you so we can throw you out? Or was he saying you haven't yet got a tafkid, so here's a tafkid that we can use it for this?
There's more than one example, by the way. Because if you think that there's also a famous midrash about David Melech that asks what's the use for a spider.
Yeah.
There's also one I think about I forgot who asked about a mosquito. By the way, another issue about with Titus again. So you can find more of those same ideas and then future finding there.
No, I'm just saying
kind
his
of
continuation doesn't tell you which of the two options it is.
Well, okay.
Presumably it was the nicer one, but okay.
Well, God says to him, accept the raven, because in the future he has those you need for him. Amar lo imatai. Noach says when. Amar lo ad yavoshet hamayim al haaretz atid tzaddik echad la'amod le'yebesh ha'olam. In the future, there's going to be a tzaddik who's going to dry up the world, similar to how I dried up, or how the world
when was this
is getting dried.
Is that the mumble?
When was this written?
Bereshit Rabbah?
Yeah.
That's one of the earliest midrashim. I think 3rd century CE, roughly.
Sure.
Why?
I was just trying to figure out, in relation to the whole story that we're talking about, when that was written, and figure out if this was written before or after, what they're trying to figure out.
Meaning, is it retroactively?
Yeah.
It's easy to tell the story and say, Hashem said that there's going to be this guy happening. Or if it happened before the decree, before Eliyahu, that would be cool.
This midrash?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't think any midrashim were written like in the days of Eliyahu, as far as I know. But
That's a shame.
yeah,
Isn't that really cool?
yeah.
Called it.
But I think Bereshit Rabbah is one of the earliest midrashim that we have. It's like the times of the Tanaim. Yeah. Okay, so there's going to be a tzaddik who will dry the world through his decree. And I need the raven in order to feed him. Okay, so first of all, here it's clear that the Orvim, in the eyes of this midrash, are ravens and not people named Orev or Orvim. Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Nechemia. Okay, it's a debate between Rabbi Yehuda and Nechemia. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Iri bitchum Beit Shanu Shma Aravi. Okay, never mind. So Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's a place named Aravi. And so the Orvim were from Aravi. Rabbi Nechemia Omer, Orvim Mamashi. No, it was real ravens. Where did they bring the bread from? Mishulchano Shel Shafat. And he says that it came from the table of Yoshaphat and not the table of Achav. Okay? Psikta Zutarta says as follows. Amar lo ha'orev leNoach Rabcha sena'etni. So the raven says to Noach, your master hates me. In other words, God. Ve'ata senatani. And you hate me too. The raven says, everybody hates me. Okay? Nobody loves me. Right. Rabcha sena'ani. Right? Your master God hates me. Why? Shnamar mina ba'ama Torah shiv'a shiva. Right, the kosher animals, they get 7 to survive the flood, but I'm the raven, there's only 2 of us that get to survive.
I don't even like the Alga.
Right, Vatas Natani, and you hate me. You're sending me now to go find dry land somewhere, and if I die on the way, so then our species goes extinct. Amar le Noach says, so Noach says again, who needs you, right? I think Pshat is the less nice version. Why does the world need you, Raven? Lo la'achila v'lo korban. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, kiblu ad yavo shenamayim et tzaddik echad la'amod le'besh ha'olam v'ani avticho elav. God says, accept him because Eliyahu need him. Hadu yichtiv ha'ovim mevin lo lechem basar. Amar Rav, mivei tabcha de'achav. And Rav says that it came from the house of Achav. Ainu dichtiv v'yatzei atzo v'shuv b'shuvato. Okay, so basically, the Psikta Zutarta and the Bereshit Rabbah bring 2 very similar traditions about tying it to the raven of Noach, but the difference is that Bereshit Rabbah says that it came from Yehoshaphat, similar to what we saw in the Veiko Rabbah and the Tanchumi Yilamdenu, whereas Psikta Zutarta says it comes from Achav's house, similar to what we saw in the Gemarot, in Hullin and in Sanhedrin. So we see that this debate carries through even into the Midrashim that tie this to the story of Noach. Just to conclude, I want to try to look at this commentary of the Eitz Yosef, which is a commentary on the Midrash Rabbah, on Bereshit Rabbah, where I think he kind of gets to the point. We explained what this debate might be about in terms of whether the meat came from Yehoshaphat or Achav's house, in the halachic sense of trying to kind of fit it into the discussion of is meat from the Yisrael Mumar permitted. But what is the agadic reason for this debate? Perhaps. And so we touched on it by saying that the opinion that said that it came from Yehoshaphat's house was to say there's no way Eliyahu could have eaten from the meat, right? Why would God have Eliyahu eat tamei meat, right? Of course he would ideally want him to have pure meat, and the birds would not bring meat to Eliyahu that came from a house of Avodah Zarah. So then what's the explanation for the other side? Like we just, like Reuven asked, why then, if you say that it's from the house of Achav, why have Eliyahu eat that meat? Even if you say, okay, letzorach sha'ah, he was allowed to override the Isur, but why make Eliyahu do that? Why, if there was other options? And that's what the Eitz Yosef suggests here. Hu Eliyahu she'atzar et hashamayim ad sheyavsha haaretz. U'bato zman nistar b'nachal Krit lifnei Izavel. He was hiding. V'yu orvim mivi'in lo parnasato. V'haya retzono yitbarach sheyimu rachamav aleihem levakesh aleihem rachamim. לפיכך הזמין השם פרנסתו על ידי העורבים, להורות לו שאף העורב, שהוא אכזר, נמצא בו צד רחמים לפרנסנו ברעב. That it's a famine, and ravens are generally cruel. Right? They're birds that don't have mercy on their young, and they're cruel birds. And so God specifically brought ravens to feed Eliyahu, because Eliyahu came and out of nowhere and decreed a famine on the whole land. And that's a cruel thing to do, right? Even if he had his reasons or his agenda, right? We saw Sanhedrin try to give an explanation, which is even more trait. He was arguing with Achav, or trying to prove Achav wrong, but everybody else suffers. All of Bnei Yisrael suffer. So God is trying to indirectly teach Eliyahu a musar by having the ravens come and feed him, to say the ravens are cruel, but they're providing to you, even though they don't generally do that. So maybe you should also have rachamim on the people that you decreed a famine on as well. Lachen yevakesh rachamim aleihem לתת להם פליטה ברעב, וכן עשה אליהו, and eventually that's what happens. So I'd like to suggest to extend this Eitz Yosef's idea to the discussion about, and this is, I don't think that Eitz Yosef says, this is my extension, that perhaps we can offer a similar explanation for the idea of the house of Achav, right? That normally Eliyahu, we said, right, the Midrash in the Tanchuma says, of course it had to have come from Yehoshaphat's house, because Eliyahu was such a tzaddik, of course he wouldn't eat the meat that came from a place that was tameh. But God is giving Eliyahu Musar here and saying to him, listen, you're getting meat that's is coming from the birds, and the orev is a tameh bird, right? It's achzar, but it's also a bird that's not a pure bird. And the meat you're getting is tameh as well. To remind him, where are you getting your sustenance from? You're getting it from a bird that's cruel, and you're getting it from Achav's house. You are surviving from the very place that you are now decreeing a famine against, right? From Achav, he's the one who's keeping you alive. And you're arguing with him, right? So Kal V'chomer, for sure, B'nai Yisrael, you should have mercy on. And so perhaps that's really more of the hashkafic reason why, to argue why it came from Achav's house, is that would really kind of teach Eliyahu a lesson. You're hiding over there and you need sustenance, but you're getting sustained from the very place that you're trying to decree against.
A few points.
Yep.
Number one, a small little biography fact. Yehoshaphat was married to Achav's daughter. Start with that. That's a little stuff that wasn't mentioned. Mm-hmm. Number two, you speak about the cruelty, which is interesting because, you can think about what is the symbol of the raven. You see, like in Norse mythology, you have Odin come with the ravens, having one eye, and the whole idea of cruelty. What it really projects, is kind of from our culture. The idea is something that signifies cruelty should not be on our plate, or we should not consume from it. So there's another thing. Mm-hmm. And thirdly is beyond that. I think needs to be said is I forget that point. So we said daughter. Oh, third point is that given that if Eliyahu is receiving food from Achav in some way, shape, or form, if we based on point A, that means, in other words, God is telling Eliyahu, even though you're criticizing the kingdom and criticizing and going against the stuff that Achav is doing, his kingship is legitimate. It means you can't take away his legitimacy to rule.
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
So that's another thought.
Yep. Yeah, interesting. Right.
Because we know later on, because we know that Eliyahu used to run before the chariot of Achav.
Right.
Eliyahu היה רץ לפני מרכבתו של Achav. So.
Right. Yep.
And that fits with what you were saying at the end.
Yeah, that, right. I think, so it's interesting, right, exactly. Here, God is, right, Eliyahu comes out of, and it fits, I think, nicely with the Psukim. Eliyahu comes out of nowhere, decrees a famine on the whole Eretz Yisrael. So God says to him, why don't you go to Nachal Kurit, take it easy, and I'll bring you food from these birds that comes from Achav's house, right? In other words, Eliyahu has a if you read the psukim around Eliyahu, he has a lesson to learn, right? And the whole story of Kino Kineti, and then God says Lechu Meshachtat. Ultimately, he's too much of a kanai for this world, right? He has to go up to heaven, literally and figuratively, because he can't live amongst the people. He decrees a famine against everyone, and God's trying to teach him through the fact that he's sustained through the Orvim Tmeim, and from Achav's house, perhaps, that you need to recognize that also, help comes from unexpected places, and that you need to be thankful for that. I think, not to go into this, but there's similar message with Yonah in a certain sense as well, right? The Kikayon at the end is there's a message there that God tries to teach Yonah as well, that,
He likes a solid time out, God. He's like, go sit down.
Yeah,
think about what you've done.
Right. All right, thank you.